Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Kathleen Regan, and I'd like to welcome you all to a LexisNexis complimentary CLE accredited webinar titled Big Data Governance. Before I introduce our speakers, I have a few announcements about today's event. For our phone participants only, if a problem arises during the program, dial *0 for the operator. For continuing education purposes, those parties listening by phone only, please be sure that you have identified yourself with the operator. If your name has not been taken, please dial *0 now and an operator will take your information. Those audience members listening via computer do not need to identify themselves with an operator. In order to process your CLE credit, please download and complete the CLE form you will find via the gray widget in the bottom dock of your webcast console. Please promptly return those forms as instructed within them to the LexisNexis CLE team. We suggest downloading these materials shortly after the program begins. Please consult your local rules for further guidance on CLE or contact LexisNexis at cle@lexisnexis.com. Please take note of the survey that is available to you at the conclusion of the webinar. We ask that you please complete the survey as the results are a vital tool for us to continue to bring you outstanding programs that meet your needs. All attorneys joining us today will be given 2 4-digit codes announced throughout today's call. Please be ready at all times to write these codes down so you may enter them on the appropriate CLE paperwork. These codes are required to receive your credits and verify your active participation in today's call. You must attend the entire event in order to receive these codes. Again, all CLE material may be downloaded via the gray CLE widget in the bottom dock of your webcast console. The panelists welcome your questions. You may submit your questions via the Q&A tab of the webinar platform throughout our program today. The speakers will try to address as many audience questions that are submitted through the tab as possible. Please keep in mind all questions may not be answered due to time constraints. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Complete biographies are included with today's PowerPoint materials. Kirk Herath is Vice President, Associate General Counsel, and Chief Privacy Officer for Nationwide Insurance Companies and Affiliates based in Columbus, Ohio. Among other things, Kirk heads up a team that has primary responsibility for corporate private policy and implementing privacy across all lines of business. He represents Nationwide's interests on many industry and business privacy groups and before legislative and regulatory bodies. Andrea Hoy is CEO of A. Hoy & Associates and has recently founded SenseOne Security Incorporated, a thriving information security consulting firm that was established to provide essential information security expertise on immediate and specific information security and business continuity planning. Andrea's leadership positions in information security and business continuity include dozens of marquee clients. Ron Raether is a partner at Faruki, Ireland & Cox and has broad experience with technology-related issues. Ron not only works with companies which have experienced unauthorized access to consumer data or have been named defendants in class actions and before the Federal Trade Commission, but has also advised companies in developing practices and policies to proactively address these issues. And we thank the 3 of them for their participation today. Again, I would remind you to please take a moment to complete the survey at the conclusion of today's webinar. Your comments and feedback help us shape great programs like this one on topics that are important to you. And finally, before we begin, I'd like to announce today's first CLE code. Attendees, please take note. The first CLE code for today's webinar is 0867. Again, the first CLE code for today's webinar is 0867. And panelists, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. This is Ron Raether, and I am privileged and honored to be able to have such a distinguished panel assisting on today's presentation. We're going to try to make this interesting and engaging and educational for you. There's been a lot of media attention given to the issue of big data. And we're going to start off this presentation going over sort of what big data means. what it means to a variety of different audiences and their perceptions of big data and the implications of that. I think you'll see that by the end, big data is in the eye of the beholder, that the true agreed upon definition of big data is still out there. But I think you'll also find that there are some parameters within which we can use to draw and determine what is big data, or at least when are we playing in the sandbox of big data. After that, we put together a number of case studies that Kirk and Andrea and I have experienced either hypothetically or in reality, and we'll keep that to ourselves of which of the two is true. But these scenarios, I think, will help us play out the conversation, the issues, and the resolution of those issues when it comes to dealing with the various issues that arise with respect to big data. Before we jump into the meat of what we're here to talk about today, I will say on behalf of myself and the other panelists that we're here today talking on our own. These are our personal opinions. They're not the opinions of our companies or partners or any of the agencies or entities that we might be affiliated with. These are our own personal opinions. So the first slide that you see out there, you may be wondering, what is this really all about? And that is a picture of me and my daughter, and we took a trip recently this summer. And, to me, it sort of exemplifies a lot of what people think in terms of big data, and frankly, one of the means by which companies look at big data and see value in it. And by that, I mean predictive marketing. So having information that can help companies determine what their customers' personal interests might be through a variety of data points, and then being able to not waste resources, but instead focus the appropriate marketing, the appropriate sales messaging to try to pique what is already an interest of the consumer, so that hopefully they'll purchase the good or service. So I think that, this was a good example for me, I think, to kick off the conversation, because obviously to go where I went, so you'll see in the caption there it says, who knows where I went and what I bought. It's not a great mystery because my daughter has the sweatshirt on that says where we went. But I think more importantly, think through the transaction process, sort of the data points and the data trail that I created before we went out there and when we were out there. So before we went, I had to book a plane ticket, book a hotel. I used a credit card to do that. So already we have three sources. The credit card company, if I use one card, it could be multiple credit cards. We have the airline, we have the hotel, all of which have information about me. The airline knows that I'm flying into Missoula, Montana. The hotel knows that I am staying up in northern Montana, so in a city just outside of Glacier National Park. The banks know that I use my credit card to buy a ticket from Delta. Oftentimes in the detail, it'll say where I'm going. They'll certainly know that I booked a hotel reservation with a chain or with a small boutique out just outside of Glacier National Park. And then once we get there, I'm using my credit card to buy supplies that we needed to go hiking. So that was at REI. I'm using my credit card again. Could be a different one. My daughter might be posting pictures of us in Montana on Instagram. She could have put on Facebook where we were going and what we're doing. Ultimately, maybe while we were out there, and I think this may have happened, my daughter purchased and downloaded a song. So the IP address that would have been associated with that transaction would have provided some proximity in terms of where we were at. The point being that there's a lot of points along that trip where we created a digital footprint, sometimes through the same organization, sometimes through multiple organizations. But there's that data out there. And the question really with big data is it's out there. There's a lot of data. How can you pull it together and then begin to do some predictive marketing, use that data in a means or a method that's going to provide something useful for the business. So as I mentioned, what is big data? It is sometimes, I think, difficult to define, and obviously the perceptions are different depending upon who you're asking the question of in terms of what is big data. So it's certainly been in the news. I think if you haven't followed these issues, you might not be aware of this, but recently the University of Washington just announced a $38 million grant that they're going to use to sponsor research at the university in terms of how they can use all of the data that's available to researchers in terms of better research and results. MIT recently announced a working group, again, to look not at just how to use the data, but some of these policy, ethical issues around the use of big data and all these data points. And kind of interesting to me, if you follow privacy law, there was an EU commissioner recently that was talking about the fact that there's been 40% growth in the big data services market. So in other words, companies that support and provide services and applications to help others be able to manage, analyze, and use all of the data points that are being collected by those companies. And the EU commissioner was suggesting that maybe a need for adjusting of public policies and privacy requirements within the EU to help foster that industry and allow the European Union to be a bed for that development, or for the development of that industry. Interesting because EU for a decade plus has touted itself as being more restrictive in terms of privacy and buttoning down more restrictively sensitive information. So let's just think about some of these perceptions that have been out there in terms of big data, and I think some of these themes are uniform, whether you're talking about the public, press, or regulators. But essentially, in that group, I'm putting together the individuals that really aren't handling and massaging and dealing with big data on a regular basis. So the first point, and I'll be frank and honest, I really don't know what this chart means. All I knew is that it shows a lot of data points, and it's certainly overwhelming. And that's certainly, I think, the perception of a lot of people, and validly so, about big data. It's a lot of information. It's overwhelming. It's hard to really put your arms around and grasp where all the data is at, where it's coming from. I suspect that Andrea or Kirk might actually get into some of the statistics, but the amount of data, especially when you compare what my Commodore 386 or my Apple IIc was capable of processing and storing locally, the amount of data out there now is overwhelming and mind-blowing if you put it in that perspective. So this visual really is big data is a lot of information. Likewise, as a consequence, it's really scary to people. So big data, when it's not understood, when you just think about, as I went through my example about Glacier, you get a big brother sense, right? That there's somebody actually looking at what I'm doing. I mentioned that there's that data out there, the fact that I booked a ticket with the airline, the hotel, what I purchased. It's out there, but is it really centralized anywhere, and is anyone really analyzing it? Do they have the capabilities of doing so? They may not today, but certainly I think in the foreseeable future, that's obviously a consequence and benefit, or could be, as depicted by this particular slide. Big data could be scary for a lot of people, and certainly I think in terms of the press, the public, and the regulators, people see big data as something that is frightening and scary. And I might mention it also might be a consequence of just like ghosts. It's something that they don't understand, but I threw out an opinion there. So why are people worried about you? And I think if you can see this theme carrying through, with respect to my glacier trip, our concern is that people are watching us and they're paying attention to what we're doing and they're analyzing what we're doing, and there's a certain creepiness factor with respect to that. And certainly that is in large part, I think, what the media has been grasping onto when they talk about big data, which is, of course, in turn creating the public perception about big data and a lot of the misgivings with respect to big data. So certainly I think it's fair to say that when you think about the public, when you think about the FTC, the major concern is who's watching me, what they're doing, what information do they have, and are they using it. It's not really conveyed in here, but the question that they really ought to be asking is that information being used in a productive, meaningful way to benefit the consumer as opposed to a more nefarious, harmful way. And obviously I don't think anybody would condone or think that it's appropriate to use this data for harmful purposes, obviously, but for commercially practical, beneficial purposes, that's the big question and the point out there is should this data be used and made available for that. Internal perceptions, and by that I mean within companies. So regardless of what vertical, what industry you're in, quite likely there's data. I think it's fair to say that in this day and age, no matter what business you're in, unless you have information out there, the volume of the information, the amount of information, the type of information might vary. But even I think small mom and pop store that's running credit card transactions, at least momentarily, has data and has information about us. When you can go all the way to the other extreme of like Google, which obviously has a lot more information about each of us. So internal perceptions, we're really talking about companies and the data that flows through those companies. And certainly the CEO, sales, marketing, the revenue generating side of the businesses look to big data and see it as a great opportunity or an untapped opportunity either to enhance their own marketing or sales efforts or as a derivative revenue stream. So if I can't use the data myself, maybe I can sell this data to somebody else who will pay me money so I can generate revenue, and they in turn can use that data to their benefit. Of course, the sales and marketing think of that when we talk about the chief information officer or chief information security officer and the IT staff. We're talking about a lot more work, a lot more resources, stress, concerns around how we're going to manage the intake of that data, protect the security of that data, and then ultimately be able to mine and use that data for whatever purpose the business ultimately has designed. And then from compliance, so this is legal, human resources, we're worried about the risk. So a lot of times when you look at good information security practices and policies, one mantra is obviously keep only what you need and keep it so long as you need it, and only give access to that information to the people that have an existing legitimate use. And a lot of those issues and questions come into play, and we struggle with when dealing with big data. So of course I can't do an IT-related presentation without at least one Dilbert cartoon, which I think portrays from the CEO's perspective the point I was trying to make, at least that a quintillion bytes of data, that there must be some money that can be made out of that. So let's figure out how we can use that information in this case to save the company from bankruptcy. I think the other perception from business in this cartoon, I think, displays it is, we're in a battle with your competitors, the big stool being the big data and the little stool being the company that hasn't taken advantage of big data. Are you at a competitive disadvantage? So it's not a question of whether I should do it in order to generate revenue or profits, but it's a question of if I don't do it, do I put my company at a competitive disadvantage? And I think that's a realistic and appropriate question for companies to be able to be asking themselves. And then this is, we can debate whether there's 3 V's or 4 V's of big data, but this one is I think, simplistic and sort of puts, to a certain extent, the parameters. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't think anyone has a good, true definition of big data. But looking at these 3 V's, it begins to give us some parameters. So we're looking at volume, so how much information. So this one says terabytes, but now we're talking about petabytes, which is a term that maybe Andrea or Kirk can better define and help us to understand really how much information that actually is, and how that compares to what we were dealing with and using in the past. Velocity. So by that it means having that data available and being able to access it real time. So for my parlance, it's often, is the data online versus off in backup tapes? So we may have had a lot of this information. We may have had petabytes of data back on backup tapes, but never sitting in a live environment on servers that can be accessed with code in real time. And then the other component would be variety. So it's information coming from not a single source but multiple sources. And if you've been involved in data and information technology, one of the initial challenges is that there are a lot of different languages. And I don't mean languages. I guess the comparison I would put is if you can manage and you can structure your data in a number of different ways. And so if you walked in a room and there was somebody, think of it this way, that one company, all they speak is Italian, another company, all they speak is Russian, another company, all they speak is French, and another company, all they speak is English, and that's how their data is organized. And you bring them all into a single room, and if they all start talking at the same time, it sounds like a lot of gibberish. And that's the way data can be when it's coming from multiple sources. So you have to have a point in the process where you've taken the various means by which data is organized among these various sources and standardize them all to a single structure. In my example, the same language. And that's really where the variety comes into play.
Yeah, that's perfect for explaining what that 4th V, if you did think of a 4th V, it's usually veracity, which is kind of the messiness of the data. So is it too hard to distinguish, the forest from the trees? You've got so much data there that you can't even tell what's good and what's bad data. It's just all there. And also to put the petabytes in perspective, kind of think of it as 1,000,000 gigabytes would be a petabyte.
In other words, a really expensive iPad.
Very.
So those are really the 3 V's, and sort of my last slide on this point. Again, to come back to my theme, it says, "Is this a good time to tell you I don't know what big data means?" After we've already built all the systems. With that, I want to move into really the case studies and where I think the value of this presentation really comes out, because of Kirk and Andrea have a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge, and I think it's a benefit to us to be able to hear what they have to say in terms of each of these scenarios. So for those following along that aren't on the computer, I assume you have a hard copy of the slides in front of you. We are at slide numbered 15. It's numbered 15. It's 17 on what I'm viewing. And each of these cases build upon each other. So we really start with a scenario of Acme Corporation. They have a lot of identifiable consumer data, and what that really just means is that there's names, addresses, maybe emails, maybe phone numbers, but in other words, information that allows the user to be able to tell that this relates to Ron Raether or Andrea Hoy. And in particular for Acme, they have a co-branded credit card that's been issued by Big Bank. And they can track, or they're getting data points when people make purchases, the location of where the purchase is made, and that could include which big bank ATM is used to withdraw money. So maybe some people think, I can pay with cash and people won't know what I'm doing. But if I use the ATM in Glacier, Montana, or if I use the ATM at Paradise Island Mall, that tells people at least that I'm in the area and that at Paradise Mall, for example, I'm shopping. It also tells some information about what products are purchased and how much money spent, and especially purchases that are going through at Acme stores. That's being collected. So independent of the branded credit card, when somebody goes to the Acme store, they're keeping track of what you're buying and how much you're spending, as well as purchases that are made through the website. Including consumer, there's information that they also have. Maybe you signed up for the loyalty program at Acme, and so they have loyalty information, maybe demographic information, how many people in your household, what your range of annual income is, what zip code you live in, is it an affluent zip code or an urban industrial zip code, the types of information that I'm sure each of us are familiar with in terms of a loyalty program.
And then to add to that, one of the areas that some people don't think about is, so we're also trying to place security on this data at the same time. So what the company Acme may be doing is looking and saying, okay, I'm also going to track how you authenticate into my system when you're using your credit card or your debit card. I'm going to look at, for instance, what operating system you're coming off of, what browser you're using. Are you using Safari, Mozilla, Firefox, Internet Explorer? And I may be capturing that as well, just so that I can identify for sure that's you. And if it isn't, I may ask some additional questions, or I may turn around and call your phone number to validate that you're really online trying to do a transaction with us. Or maybe that you're really in Montana and that somebody else hasn't just pilfered your card and gone off and they're having a nice vacation.
And IP address, which your IP address could also tell you who your service provider is.
Right. And it actually will also look at language, too. Sometimes some of the companies are also collecting what language you're doing your transaction in as well, at least the language that's resident on your computer that you're accessing the data. The other things that might come up in this area that may be of interest as far as the organization is concerned is also, for instance, the filtering of that data as it's coming into and going out of the organization, and what regulatory issues that we may have decided as far as what we're going to collect, and whether we provided you that information that we are going to collect it.
So, for example, a financial institution and having to address Graham-Leach-Bliley, or a healthcare provider, and is it personal health information?
Right. Does it fall within HIPAA?
Does it fall within HIPAA? So, with Acme and Big Bank, we have certainly financial information, so Graham-Leach-Bliley. Under our first scenario, the assumption is that Acme currently doesn't have a specific and intended use for the data. They just, the CEO or somebody in sales has decided that everyone else is keeping their data. It's too valuable to just let it slip away and dissipate. And so rather than letting it being deleted, we're just going to keep it, even though we don't have an existing pending intended purpose for it. So, Andrea, that scenario to me isn't too uncommon in my experience. And so what are some of the administrative and technical issues that you see companies having to address when they first start into the big data world?
So some of the things that come up immediately is first how to protect all this big data. We've decided to gather it, right? You go back to your Dilbert cartoon. We've decided to gather it all, but now what do we do with it? And one of the biggest challenges I think the corporations are having is how do they protect that data from a data breach? Because now you've got all these hackers out there realizing that companies are changing the way they're using information. You've got pharmaceutical companies collecting information on their patients and what drugs they're taking, which drugs have have more preference in the industry versus others? Which ones are the doctors prescribing more? From a sales perspective, this is interest marketing perspective. So what we're finding is we're coming up with various security tools that may or may not have been there previously, but we're utilizing them in different ways. So from an internal perspective, you might be using a web filtering tool like a WebSense that's capturing and collecting all the websites that were visited or all the retail sites that a consumer might be using or that your employees might be using even. Whereas from an external perspective, we're looking at the authentication mechanisms, right? Are we going to do a challenge response at a certain point? Maybe the person's only buying $10, $100 worth of goods from Acme, but what happens if all of a sudden their purchase order becomes $100,000? Are we going to set certain parameters to that to maybe ask for a different way of authenticating that this individual is really the card holder? Other things are, as far as the privacy policy, when you turn around and determine the original privacy policy that may have been placed there a long time ago based on just having a website, all of a sudden if you're collecting this consumer information, even though you may not know what it's for, do you need to readdress that privacy policy to let people know what you're collecting and perhaps why? And that's kind of hard to do if you don't know the why yet.
But sometimes even just that retention of information. So we have, from a hacker's perspective, we have a bigger treasure chest now, right? Because we have more data than we might have been retaining before, and I think we have more points along the the architecture of the infrastructure. In other words, where the data is sitting and where it's moving to. So there's greater points of vulnerability that have to be addressed from a security perspective. But so Kirk, what are we've talked about policies and we've talked about some of the data security, but what are some of the other things that companies have to address and be concerned about when they first make this decision to start retaining all this information before they deleted, and at this point they don't have a specific use for it?
Well, I don't think this is that dissimilar to where most of us were in the late 90s, early 2000s. One day, be it our sales or our marketing areas, they wake up and realize that they have this fairly large cache of data. They have undefined reasons for collecting it. In some cases it's directly related to the products or services that you serve. So I guess I'd step back even a little farther, and I would say, do we have do you have the roles in place? Someone like Andrea, who is a deep expert in information security and technology, and someone like either you or Ron, who have experience in the legal issues and the ramifications for various uses of the information. So I mean, you've got from administrative, just role-based. You have the organization, the infrastructure, back to sort of people, process, and technology. So you have the people who are there to sort of ask the questions and be part of this larger team that's going to try to figure out, as we evolve through these different case studies, how to use the data. And the privacy policy I guess it's assumed here, and I guess we probably should assume that they have one. But as Andrea said, what does it say? So a privacy policy is not aspirational. It usually is simply a mirror of your data practices up to that point. Privacy policies do evolve and change. Most companies, I would agree today, have them. I question sometimes whether a lot of them actually have the infrastructure to support what it is that they say they do. I mean, to me, it's always interesting when I've been challenged, if we just change our privacy policy, we can do this. And I'm like, the privacy policy is just the mirror of your practices. It's our data practices, how we collect, how we use, how we store, how we reuse, and we need to provide that to the customers. And regarding customers, so have you, do we have preferences? Have we through our privacy statement or some other means had customers agree to opt in to specific types of programs, thereby limiting our use? Have they opted out? Do we have an opt-out? Do we have an opt-out privacy statement that says that we won't actually use your information for certain purposes? I mean, some privacy statements are so broad as to say we will not ever use your data for marketing purposes. There are very few of them these days, but I know, going back a few years, they were a little more frequent than usual, and I still get them. I'm one of these bizarros that still reads these things. The contracts. So depending on your sales force, depending on how you actually sell your products or services, you're going to have different methods of sale. You're going to do it through independent. So for our company, we have different types of sales channels, some of which we quote-unquote own, right? So we have direct methods. We would own any of the data resulting from that. We have complete independent channels where the agent actually owns the customer data and we're the custodian of that data. We have affinity partnerships with organizations. So, if I have an affinity deal with a big, consumer credit union, and then I turn around and try to market the consumer credit union's customers who come to me through this affinity deal for auto insurance, credit cards issued in my bank's name, there probably is a contract out there that actually prohibits that activity. And so you have to have a sort of the big glowing database to manage the big data, where people's preferences as well as contractual restrictions, relationship restrictions are already resident and that you can scrub things against. And then there's this concept of data minimization, which I think those of us who practice in this space often preach. I'm not sure it's listened to very often, but if you go back to the fair information practices, there's sort of the foundation of our modern privacy laws like GLB and HIPAA, and even, quite frankly, the EU privacy laws. Data minimization is baked in there. It's sort of, you should not collect more information than you need to do whatever it is you need to do. So if I'm underwriting insurance, I should only collect the information necessary to underwrite insurance. If I don't need to know the race of the person, and I don't for insurance, then I shouldn't be collecting it.
And, Kirk, when you're talking, it really raises an interesting issue for me, because in this particular scenario, and again, it's not unusual, that the company is deciding to keep data for a use, and it's not sure exactly what the use is, but it has to deal with its existing regime. So whether it be privacy policies or other data minimization rules, which just for those not in this area, it's what I was referring to earlier about only keeping as much data as you need for only how long you need it and giving access to only the people that need access. That's data minimization. So we're dealing with an existing infrastructure, and one of the interesting things that I've come across is the issue of, we're talking really about good data management practices, and one of those components is data mapping and data classification. And that's often done in the existing regime. And when you move to big data, sometimes and quite often you're keeping fields and types of information that before you were disposing of. So it might not be within your existing data classification, data mapping rules, what you have, because it's a new, different set. So I don't know, Andrea or Kirk, if you want to talk to your experience, and when you make that shift to big data, what happens with data classification and mapping, and do people too often assume that the big data information is the same information they've always been keeping, when actually it's morphed into something different?
So one thing that's really, really different about big data that a lot of people don't grasp right away is that we're all used to, I think, thinking of things in segments and buckets. So if I want to know something about what our sales figures were, I go to the sales department, they have a relational database, they pull it out of there. Or if I'm wondering what our average cost per employee is, I go to HR, they've got it in their payroll database, or if I need something in regards to how many, from a demographics perspective, I'll go to marketing. I won't go to sales for that. I'll go to marketing. What big data does for us, where it is a game changer really, is that instead of having to go to 3 different relational databases, I'm now going to one place. Going back to your little cartoon where the guy is about to cut the ribbon, I'm now going to one huge server farm, but all the data is mixed up together now. And basically it's really more how the software pulls that data out. That's what makes big data. And I think that's the hardest thing people have to grasp is everybody hears the word big data, but they don't necessarily know what it means to them in English. And it's mainly that now from a analytics perspective, I've got all this data in one place and I'm just basically pulling that from where it is to create the reporting or create the information I want. And I think the hardest, most difficult part about that is now, let's say I've got a case where I'm trying to subpoena some information. What happens with e-forensics and discovery, where it used to be I knew exactly where I needed to go. I knew that, okay, all the people from that took this drug, perhaps that might have been potentially part of this class action, should be in this specific database. That's not the case anymore. With an e-forensics, from an e-forensics and discovery perspective, I may not be able to identify exactly where that data is because it's now being pulled from multiple resources. And there's no answer for that yet, by the way. It's just something that we're going to have to find out as it grows, as big data grows.
I would say that it's really hard if you don't have a data classification schema in place before you decide to sort of begin merging all these different databases together. It's very hard and very expensive to do it sort of post hoc. And exactly what Andrea described is true. You basically lose any way of figuring out what data you have in totality. So I mean, you can always find it with enough time and trouble and enough money throwing at it, but it really is. It's for legacy companies who've been around and begin to sort of ad hoc do it. I would say that they end up in a place where they're, in many cases, they get so much data they don't actually know how to use it. So,
no,
which I think
Kirk
means
brings up a great point there.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just to say, Kirk brings a great point. Those that have already formalized data classification, it might be a little bit easier for them because hopefully their folks are used to classifying the data, so at least you know what types of data it might be. But for those that aren't even used to doing that, it's going to be very difficult.
But just like data retention, I mean, most companies should have a data retention policy. Financial service companies are generally at some level either required to do it, or they do it because it's a great way to cleanse the data and get rid of old data that's sitting around that might actually hurt you. But you know, if you've got a data retention policy, and if it's architected into your systems, you know, you're cleansing the data. So you should, you know, there's nothing worse than bad old data, right? And because it doesn't, it's a net liability for you because you've got to have all of these protections in place that are expensive. If you lose it, which we'll get into in a little bit, I think, if you lose it, it's very costly from a breach notification and sort of regulatory investigation perspective. So the worst thing to have is big data that that's old and that you don't know how to actually use, and it has no purpose because it's a net liability when you sort of take the blindfolded lady and you put the potential of its use on one side and then the liability and risk on the other. If you have no discernible use or purpose for the data other than we might use it on a rainy day, you should get rid of it because the liability and the cost of protecting it are far outweigh any sort of future potential use that's undefined.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think from a CTO perspective, the Chief Technology Officer perspective, it's going to be a lot more expensive to try to make use of that data. And ultimately, you may not be able to achieve the intended goal. And I don't think the CEOs and the sales necessarily always understand that. And then from a compliance perspective, if we can't tell what data it is and where it came from, the answer is normally no, you can't use it. Or if you're going to use it, it has to be subject to the most restrictive laws or policies out there that could apply to that data, which again drives up price.
It drives it up immeasurably. And I mean, something we haven't really talked about, and which is sort of the new role that's sort of burgeoning around this data governance. And I know data governance means it's like big data. It means different things, different companies. But you know, it's an amalgam of IT, legal, business processes, and it's really trying to get a handle around what we're grappling with today for any individual enterprise.
You know, and I think that is a good transition because, you know, obviously from our perspective, it's sort of like writing a piece of software without knowing what you want that software to do. You really can't write a good piece of software.
Right.
Same thing with collecting the data. It's really, I think, a bad tactic to just keep the data without knowing how you're ultimately going to use it. So if not having the complete list, at least having a good list so that you can build your processes and build your technology around what you ultimately hope to use that information for.
I mean, right. I mean, I'm not going to go to an airport wanting to go to Seattle, thinking I want to go to Seattle and just jump on the first airplane that comes along. I'm going to find the actual one that'll take me to Seattle and plan that trip accordingly, or to Glacier National Park.
My favorite place in the world, by the way. Another advertisement. But you know, moving on to case to the sort of next variation of the case, you know, Acme finally decides that it has a purpose and defines it as improving product offerings. In other words, looking at user experience, what they're purchasing, and making it a better experience for the consumer, and then target marketing, so sending to people marketing in terms of what they're actually interested in and might want to buy, as opposed to just dumping everything on them. So, you know, Kirk, what if anything, you know, how does the approach differ now that you have a defined purpose?
Well, I mean, the defined purpose should map back to your privacy notice, and if it doesn't, then you should amend your privacy notice and make those updates and give people time to process that. You might have to provide a preference option, like an opt-out, depending if you're going to share the data with third parties. You may have to get permission. So Vermont is a state that requires you to pretty much get an opt-in for any use of data. And then there's just sort of the be rational with how you're going to. I mean, I have found there's almost always a way to use data legally. It may not be free and it may not be the most direct means, but then you have to say, well, okay. I mean, does this marketing campaign for this product make sense? So, whatever it is that you're selling should be close or closely affiliated to the product and services that you already sell. So an insurance company wouldn't want to start sharing data and start working on target marketing for new aluminum siding or something like that. I mean, to me, there has to be some rational nexus between what you do and how the data is being used. I mean, I know reasonable minds will differ, but I think that from a customer perspective, and I think a lot of us try to put ourselves in the shoes of customers. We all are customers. We have children who are customers and spouses who are customers. I mean, we often I'll say to people, well, how would you feel if your data was used in this method? And quite frankly, that often crystallizes enough to get us to move on to something else. And then you've got you may have new regulations or compliance responsibilities. I mentioned a few minutes ago the data breach requirement. So, I mean, it's a truism that the more you touch and move data, and the more you process it, the more likely you are to have either human mistakes happen or lose it, or put it in places that are less secure and easier to get to than before. So, the data breach laws, and I think we're up to like 48 states now, 47, 48 states. Mm-hmm. Regardless of whether you are in a regulated industry like healthcare, health insurance, banking, securities, there's a nascent data security requirement built into the breach notification laws, because you're going to have breaches unless you have a data security program. And if you have a data security program and you have policies, data security policies, you have to follow them, because regulators will require you to follow your policies. So you have, even unregulated companies can find themselves and have found themselves being visited by attorneys general or the FTC, who, under the state or federal fair trade laws, will come and potentially give you an investigation and potentially end up providing you with a serious fines, or worse yet, a consent decree that requires you to do things that nobody else in your industry really has to do. So you're sort of at a competitive disadvantage because you messed up in this space. Then I think you also have to worry about if you're using the data for pre-screen marketing, you should look to see whether or not you're doing anything that would help make you run afoul of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, mm-hmm. particularly if what you're doing could be defined as a pre-screened offer. There'll be specific disclosures and opt-out requirements around those sort of offers. And then just how are you marketing? If we're marketing through the mail, that's one thing. If you are marketing through the telephone or through the email, the telephone sales compliance now is incredibly hairy. I think it is, if it's not the number one litigation matter right now, it's in the top couple. This is the compliance
TCPA.
TCPA, compliance with all the state and federal do not call laws. Are using robocalling techniques. There is, people want to market on using text messages. Well, I can tell you, it's totally permissible as long as you get their affirmative written consent. and that's not easy. Or it's very easy to fall prey to a TCPA marketing type litigation, and it is expensive, and it is strict liability. There's no, we didn't mean to. Sorry. It's like, did you make the call? Did you have permission to make the call through that device or through that means? The answer is no. Then they basically, and this is the AGs or the FTC, they'll hit you with the number of calls you made times somewhere between $500 and $1,500 per call. So, it starts to toll very, very quickly. And then canned spam, you have to comply with canned spam if you're doing email solicitations. Again, you can do it. You just have to have the right processes and procedures and programs in place to manage it. So there's a pretty large management issue it sort of sits behind the screen.
And you point out, I think, a really key factor in that there's a lot of moving parts here. And those moving parts are individualized. In other words, what permissions you may have from me, for example, could be very different from what you or Andrea provide to Acme. And so, Andrea, how are we dealing with the massive amounts of information and all of these moving balls and variations among people in terms of their permissions? How are we dealing with that from a technical perspective?
Well, so some of the auditing agencies actually are now at the point where they expect you to do quarterly audits of users that have access to this type of data and how they control it and who administers it and things like, I think he had brought up CAN spam before, even the point that it's illegal to harvest the email addresses. So let's say you've got an internet chat room or a blog to see how people like Acme. Well, just because you've gotten those email addresses and you're collecting that data, it's technically illegal for you to utilize it, without some kind of permission from that owner, from that data owner, of what his email address is or her email address is. The other thing I see that's a challenge is a lot of times when they're collecting this data and they're saying it's, for target marketing perspective, from a target marketing perspective, they're not keeping in mind, for instance, maybe the individual that they're actually marketing to who borrowed their parents' credit card is under the age of 13 and now falls under some children's online privacy protection rules of engagement. So you have to take that keep that in mind as well, that you might have a mixed audience coming to the website that even though you've defined the purposes that you want this information, have you also defined the people that are on that website providing you that information, and does that cause some disparity as far as how you have to treat that information? From a security perspective, I think Kirk already handled very well the opt-in, opt-out issues. But what we're also doing, we're finding is a lot of the tools that we use from a security perspective, we can actually refine our utilization of them. So as far as detecting specific, for instance, maybe we have a tool that's actually searching for keywords, and it may utilize that to determine whether certain data should be encrypted or not. Things of that nature is where we might come into some of the technology uses. We might use data leakage protection to ensure that none of this data after it's been produced and for the defined purpose that we stated it was going to be used, but now we're transferring it to somebody else, right? And maybe we're utilizing a third party to assist us in putting together our campaign for our next marketing. We have to make sure the protection on that data is correctly done. So we may want to utilize encryption. We may be using a DLP program or data leakage protection program to define what's going to be automatically encrypted so that the user, our employee, doesn't have to think about it. And then there may also be, marketing may use a paging optimization tool, and what that might be doing is capturing all these tags, what the user, and they're trying to better define the user experience, but the thing that they may not be looking at is performance ramifications from an IT perspective, or is this going to actually enhance the overall agility of an individual when they're going to a website, or is it actually going to diminish it because it's doing such a hard job of searching through all the data that we collected to determine what you as a user really want to see?
And I guess one of the things that I've come across that's kind of interesting is if you don't have a system that requires for individual user authentication. So in other words, there's not a unique password and user ID for each individual. Instead, they're really looking at it at a device level. It becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to manage the flow of the user's choices, and they almost have to be done transactionally. Which, as you know, weighs even further on performance. And so the tendency might be to create a shortcut, to put a cookie on that device with the privacy preferences, which obviously is problematic because you don't know who's using that device at any given time. The other thing that's of interest to me, and either you, Kirk, or Andrea can comment on it, but oftentimes, let's say you're dealing with data, or you're in an environment where opt-in, opt-out isn't mandatory, and you'll hear from sales or you'll hear from the CEO, why would I voluntarily want to give an opt-out right? Wouldn't that degrade the data that I need for the ultimate purpose? And so, how do you respond to the business when they put forward that issue to you?
Nobody opts out.
Exactly.
I mean, it's at best on with the most, with our most sensitive, sophisticated products, it might be 1%, right? I mean, it's actually under that, I think, globally for our company. So there really is, and what it does is it basically creams off the most highly sensitive people who are going to be angry trolls if something bad happens, right?
Yep.
These are people who are highly sensitive. There's a continuum, right? About 10% of the population is highly sensitive to these data privacy issues. There's, I don't know, somewhere around 25% really don't care at all, 30% maybe. I just think there hasn't actually been a study in a number of years, but that's about what it was. The rest of them are in the middle. They're privacy pragmatists. They'll trade away their data for something, depending on their own personal proclivity. So yeah, I would just say that it is usually, it actually from a customer perspective, even if they don't use it, they like to have it there, and they don't use it.
And the optics of not giving the consumer the choice are just too detrimental when balanced against the point you just made.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've actually been an advocate, devotee for years of Seth Godin's opt-in principle. I mean, to me, when I look at the the ROI on most direct marketing campaigns, even the ones that are sort of tailored, they really still don't tell you the people who actually want your product. I mean, to me, building buckets of people who have told you specifically, Kirk, I really want auto insurance. I really am interested in, new financial retirement savings plans. And that you going in that this person is open and actually looking for certain types of products, and you can go right into the pitch as to why something is good for them rather than try to convince them that they need it in the first place. So you just break right through I guess it's the ultimate in big data. It's small data.
Yeah, exactly. So we've been talking about consumers and customers. I want to shift just for a moment to talk about a different population, that being employees. And we can oftentimes pull data for performance or workplace security. And in this particular example, we could have company-issued smartphones, or we could have bring your own device. In other words, the employee-owned smartphone or devices that they're using. And we can collect data, and maybe in Acme's example, they're collecting data, again, to see if people are using the devices and the systems for legitimate business uses. They could be looking at it for reliability assurance, RAP issues. But they're out there collecting information about employees. So how does, maybe communications with customers, we know, there's this concept of consumerization, which is the blurring of the line between, my work life and my personal life. So I could also be using these devices to communicate with, my wife, or if anyone's done electronic discovery, you oftentimes learn things about your clients' employees, the affairs that they're having that you'd rather not know about. Maybe some of their own, some of other personal habits that aren't illegal, but still you would rather not know that about a person. All that data is out there in the employment environment, and companies may want to collect that and analyze it for, again, performance or security purposes. So I guess, Andrea, is that permissible? What sort of issues are coming up when we want to collect information about our employees?
So a lot of it depends, from the get-go, as far as even your new hire agreement and what you briefed during your new hire briefing. Did you provide them an acceptable use policy telling them what is right and what is wrong in the minds of the company culture there at that company? Social media policies are now becoming really prevalent, where they didn't used to even exist. It used to be just the acceptable use policy, but a lot of companies are finding that they need to differentiate how you use social media. Whether you can say something disparaging about your management on a social media site or not, or even the BYOD policy. We're finding that one of the biggest challenges in recruitment of folks in technology these days is that a lot of them are used to the devices they're used to, meaning they don't want to go to the company standard of a HP laptop or a BlackBerry cell phone. They're used to using an iPhone. They want the iPhone. They are used to using a tablet. They want a tablet. They don't want to use the company-specified device. And where that causes issues is, from a technology perspective, you're now having to support, your poor service desk or help desk is now having to support multiple platforms. There's no consistency. When somebody calls up for assistance and says, my email's not working, you're really not sure where to go to even start helping them. And then now we've put on some of the privacy policies. So I love to use the line clear but conspicuous disclosure. What is it we're really looking at? We now, from a technology perspective, I think everybody's heard of intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems. I mean, they're there mainly to protect us from malware that a malfeasant tries to put onto our system. But while it's doing that collecting, just like you were talking about some of the things you see in regards to clients that you don't really want to see, we find that with IDS, IPS, we're collecting a lot of things that either maybe negligence, maybe the employee just really doesn't realize that when they went to YouTube to go watch a video, that video had malware on it, or seeing activity there. We're also finding in some of the emails they go to, all of a sudden maybe they went to their fantasy football site. All of a sudden they're seeing that they're getting multiple emails that are ones that don't follow the acceptable use policy, but they can't seem to stop it because the malware has already been placed on their system in the work environment. You know, so the main thing is trying to put some limitations as far as what they can and cannot do. So there's some type of boundaries as far as what's acceptable. But then from a technology perspective, putting boundaries also on what's their expectation of privacy. So we've told them that we monitor everything. Do we tell them they should have absolutely no expectation of privacy? And is that realistic anymore? I think that's where some of our hardest issues are. If we say, yes, you can go to any website you want during non-working hours. So let's say at lunchtime they decide to use the desktop that they have on their desk to access some sites that are providing malware, but they don't know it. You know, is that their issue? Is that our issue? And if we see that they're looking at things that maybe talk about things that culturally the company doesn't want to support, is that an issue? Because now our IP address as a company has now been blasted to that site, and they may be doing their own big data collection of who's visiting. Oh, XYZ company's now visiting. Accune's visiting us. They must be interested in our products. Maybe not. Maybe it's just a single individual.
And with the intrusion protection system, just for some of those people on this, you know, what it's really doing is it's trying to come up with a standard for you know how whatever it is being used. So what's the normal usage parameters for a certain device, or you know, it could be a HIPS, so it could be like at a OS server level or an application server level. But essentially, it's collecting that data initially, so it can come up with what's the normal use of the system. And so when there's something outside of that parameter, a red flag goes off, and then there's somebody in the security infrastructure who then has to go and manually look and see whether that anomaly is a hacker or whether it's regular usage. And so, you know, it's the question of those people in information security. And then I use the example of e-discovery, where we're reviewing information, you know, for a litigation purpose. But obviously the net is much broader than what's actually relevant. So you end up seeing, you get access to information that could be, certainly most people consider to be private and confidential. And so having policies and procedures around what needs to be done when the information security professional comes across something that might be problematic, what they're permitted or what they're required to do with that knowledge, and certainly what they're prohibited in terms of doing with that knowledge. But, you know, Kirk, should we really care? I mean, because these are employees. I mean, do we really care whether on these privacy issues?
Well, the employees are the company, and they're the first line with the customer, and they also are the ones that make all of either the good or bad decisions around how the data is going to be used or where it's going to be stored, and frankly whether they're going to steal it or not. I thought Andrea did a great job of setting the table on this one. A few things I will add. It is probably best to set an expectation of zero policy within the workplace with obviously no video cameras in the restrooms and those sort of things. But I personally like to at the moment of hire or shortly thereafter present everybody in a company with a confidentiality agreement, which lays out their responsibilities in crystal clear language and the ramifications for not abiding by it. And it says right in there that if you're on our network and you're in our buildings, that we have the right to investigate even personal workspace and drawers and such. It's easier to disclose online. Video surveillance, I'm not sure that there are places, clearly bank lobbies, and I think you have to be reasonable with video surveillance. Again, conspicuous signage, we've all seen the signs in parking lots outside of big box stores. Back to sort of the employees, sort of as, we kind of look at employees as they're really the first firewall, right? They're back to making good and bad decisions. To some degree, we try to, help them by limiting them, even on the personal devices, and Andrea, I'm sure knows far more about the technology than me, but the mobile device management tools. So yes, they can use their personal devices, but the data, our data, where it's being processed on the personal device is actually encrypted and controlled by us. We turn capability off, so thumb drives, USB drives and such, things that could be used inappropriately, either to put viruses onto computer networks or to take data off. We track what's going in and out of the network through data loss prevention, and Andrea talked about that earlier. That's also a good way of determining whether or not people are, most of the time, what DLP finds are what I call broken business processes. They aren't nefarious. There's a standard packet of information that's got to go from here to a business client every Tuesday, and they don't use an encrypted email. We block sites, so we don't, we try. I mean, there's new sites all the time, but we try to block sites that are problematic, either from an HR perspective, as in like hate crime, sex sites, and those sort of things, or things that are nefarious and that we think might be problematic from a malware perspective. And I think that's training. I think most companies today, I think that's almost a baseline expectation. It's generally online now, but training about and it's gone beyond in the 15 odd years that I've been doing privacy and data law. It's gone from very, very compliance oriented. This is what the law is, to really more practical stuff, right? How to just be safe with data, some rights and wrongs, and more behavioral. And so I think we're all learning how to, and some of it is, and Andrea hit this, some of it's cultural, some of it's generational. The younger generation definitely has different ways of using technology than older people, but that's starting to blur now too, I think, as time goes on. So I'll let it go there. Looks like we've got a few more things to go through.
Yeah, and obviously that's changing as they begin to enter the workforce, right? So I always look at the teenagers and the college students to figure out how I need to write my policies, because they're the people that I'm really writing the policies towards in terms of how technology is being used. But let's move to the sort of the next twist on our scenario, and that's using a third-party vendor to help manage the data, help make use of the data.
Ron, please pardon this interruption. I'd like to announce the second CLE code for today's webinar. Attendees, please take note. The second CLE code for today's webinar is 4965. Again, the second code is 4965. Thank you, Ron.
You're welcome. Kirk, we've now added a third party who's going to be getting access to Acme consumer data to help Acme make use of it. So what are some of the issues that now we have to deal with that we've introduced a third party into the mix?
Well, all of the things that Andrea, you and I have been discussing now sort of go on steroids, because we have all the accountability for all of the things that we've been discussing legally from a security perspective, compliance with laws perspective. Only we've outsourced it to a party that we don't directly control. So there's a big uptick in risk and complexity. You should, depending on, I mean, everybody should have that. If you're a regulated entity, by law you have to have a contract with a third party, which outlines sort of the duties. You've got to do a risk assessment of the third party to make sure that they can do and comply with the duties that they've agreed to. You have to establish oversight procedures. One of the most difficult things today is the contract, negotiating the contract with a third party, because there has to be an appropriate amount of indemnification for breaches or noncompliance with laws, and that becomes hard. I mean, you can't make your vendor your insurer on one hand. On the other hand, if what you typically see is that the vendor trying to cap their liability at some level. It's either whatever the cost of the contract is, or maybe multiples of the cost of the contract. So if you have a vendor that, in this case, is actually storing and processing your data, and you're only paying them, let's say, I don't know, $750,000 a year to do that, and they lose it or they get hacked and you have a breach, that $750,000, if that is the limit of your liability, will be eaten up incredibly fast by just your first couple things of like sending out letters and offering credit monitoring. So, I focus, and I'll let Andrea talk about some of the technical ways you can sort of monitor third parties and assess the risk. But what I focus on in my role really is really around it's the contract, right? What can you do with the data? What can't you do with the data? Protections around it, indemnifications, responsibilities in the case of breach, and notification of us in the event of a breach. Those are the things that we really, in my team, what we focus on. We work very closely with people like Andrea in our information security area, though, to do the risk assessments.
And I think, like you mentioned, Kirk, you have to take a look back at your privacy policy as well, especially if you're a financial institution regulated by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, for example, because there are additional limits and regulations in terms of sharing data with third parties and requirements that I think you mentioned in terms of extending those requirements to the third party and limitations on what the third party can do with that data, and then obviously with the extension of the business associate requirements, the rule that was passed back in January that extended the HIPAA high-tech security requirements to business associates alleviates that somewhat in the personal health information context, but obviously doesn't dissipate the risk management issues that you identified. Which, by the way, one of the things that I've seen is the requirement that an insurance policy and that the Acme in this case be the named insured.
We've done that. We've done that in the event that the company isn't capitalized enough to really, when you do your financial risk assessment, and the company really, at the end of the day, they do something really innovative. They do something you really want them to do. But if they were to make a mistake or do something that harmed you, they didn't have the financial wherewithal to do it, and then so we will ask for a bond or for some certain amount of insurance to be entered into and set aside. And you hit on the head. I mean, right now the federal financial regulators in general are. This is probably one of the top 2 or 3 areas that they are focusing on right now with all the different industries, banks, bank holding companies, securities firms. State insurance regulators are also very interested in how you manage your third-party connectivity and outsourcing arrangements.
So Andrea, from we've been talking about sort of a policy, contractual perspective of dealing with third parties and the issues that arise. What about from a technical security perspective? What are the additional issues we need to be sensitive to from that regard, which obviously we'll have to then take into account when we write our contracts? But
that's exactly what I was thinking. Because I tell you, I work hand in hand with my legal folks all the time on things like this. Because with the third parties, unfortunately, a lot of it has to be contractual. There was that one case where the Pakistani woman said she wanted a raise, and she said, I'm going to disclose all the information from San Francisco Hospital. And San Francisco's like, I don't know what you're talking about. You don't have any of our information. But somebody kept, researching, and eventually they found out, oh, that translation firm we're using in Sausalito, guess what? We've kept them so busy they couldn't handle the work, so they outsourced to Pakistan. So that's how our data got there, because contractually, though, the rules of engagement that we had, the San Francisco had provided to Sausalito didn't apply to that third party in Pakistan. So there has to be something that goes down the line so that if a third party is committed to something contractually, if they use a subcontractor, those rules of engagement go forward, kind of that they emulate your policy and your risk management levels. The periodic security assessments that you mentioned, such as the SOX, the SSA 16s, NIST, ISO 27001, those are all from a technology perspective what we use to help vet, so to speak, a third party prior to even engaging with them or looking at ones before we renew. Because at a certain point, like you said, there may be some that don't have the capitalization to be able to support if there was a breach. Another area where technology comes into play, though, the most is, let's say we do realize that there is going to be some sensitivity and issues because the firm is too small to handle the normal security requirements we would have expectations for, yet we really want to use them because they do something that marketing can't get any other place. Maybe it's a optimization tagging or something like that. What we prefer to do then is contractually get it that we ourselves can conduct the penetration test or vulnerability assessment of them, that they'll give us the ability to go ahead and use our security tools to see if we can find the vulnerabilities in their system to address, so that they can address them, and that we can periodically do that, coordinating it through with them. But obviously that's something that has to be in the contract. And then the other thing you have to think about is also, so maybe we've got the contractual agreement with them, but because they're such a small company, maybe they use another company to store their servers, or they're using something in the cloud to handle that data or analyze the data. So you also have to make sure in the contract that when you say you want the ability to actually do a true vulnerability assessment, that all the parts that relate to your company are going to be covered. So maybe it's an application, but the application is held by a third party. Do you have a means to do a web application security review on that code? And I think earlier you had brought up data breach costs. So one of the things that I always like sharing is that what the annual cost is per personal record for a compromise. Presently, it's gone down just a little bit. So for, I think, the last Ponemon Research Institute, it was at $188 a record. And then as far as the notification cost itself, so for instance, let's say you lost your entire client database was potentially breached, depending on what state you're in as far as notification laws go. For 2012, that cost was at 57 cents just for the processing of the notification itself, not everything else surrounding the breach, the $188. So it's getting pretty substantial.
Yeah, and I think on that point, because I don't think we've touched on it, is audit logs and making sure that whatever third party that you're contracting with, that you have a good understanding. So the audit logs are basically what's happening. So it depends. There's audit logs that are being created by routers, by operating systems, by applications, and it's basically a record of what's happening in that system, in that app, or in that application. And it becomes really the fundamental set of data that we use to analyze whether there's been a breach, and more importantly, whether personally identifiable information has been extracted from the system, and so breach notification is required. So having that conversation not only about the technical and security controls, but also audit logs and what they're keeping and how long they're keeping it, and then obviously making that data accessible if there's an event, I think is another important key. But I want to move to the I'm sorry, Andrea.
I was just saying the last thing I would tell everyone to consider is also termination of the contract. So let's say you're using a cloud solution and you've terminated the contract. Do you have the right to keep and maintain that data that's presently on the cloud? Is that data still yours? How do you get that?
How do you extract it and delete it?
Mm-hmm.
So sort of moving to the next variation of the third-party scenario. So now instead of just using a third party who's going to help support the use of our data, Acme's data, we're now going to Mongo Data Corp, who has its own set of information from other sources, and we're going to give them our information so they can augment it, add, in other words, take its data, take our data, marry the information together, and hopefully the ultimate data set is going to be of more value for our use. Andrea, what happens in terms of the complications and the issues that we have to deal with now that we're not just sending our data to a third party to be used by Acme, but now we're working with Mongo Data, who, I guess you can look at it in two scenarios. One is that they put our data and now becomes part of the general pool that's accessible by anyone who contracts with Mongo Data, versus creating, a separate siloed database where that compiled data is only available for Acme.
Right, and this actually is becoming more and more common than you'd imagine. One thing that we've always had to go back and address is our T's and C's on this, as far as both with the provider as well as with if it's going to have any impact on our privacy tools and what kind of settings we have on the privacy tools. A lot of times we're finding the technology actually identifies for us that there's an issue because of some of the standards we may have set on the technology for encryption. The other area that we've really had an issue with is how do you anonymize this data? We may have collected it all, but what exactly do we want to give to Mongo Data Corp, and how is it linking to them? So let's say maybe we know that, a certain online game, going back to my past at Activision, certain online game tends to collect information on single males under the age of 40 are the ones that log into this game the most. And yet we may not go and really want to have Mongo keep the information in regards to, and his name is such and such, or his email address is such and such, and he lives at such and such. We just want to maintain who actually is using our online games, which ones are more attractive, so we can get the demographics right, so then we can then turn around and sell the appropriate ads to the right people. Because we're also finding from a technology perspective, we can automate the process of what ads go to a certain individual based upon what demographics we can collect on them.
What about from a policy perspective, Kirk? What are the new things? What are the additional issues that we need to look at and address when we're dealing with Mongo data?
Well, you'll probably find out that Mongo data is actually they won't actually agree not to use your data to augment their database. So it's sort of a quid pro quo. I mean, not always, but generally speaking, if you're augmenting, if you're buying data from someone and you're doing sort of an enhancement, a lot of your data will end up being part of their soup, right? So you'll have to look at the contractual issues and you'll have to look at your own ability to do that. Generally, you can. You do get into issues around whether or not are you selling the data? Are you not selling the data? There's FCRA risk triggers again. I think in my mind, it depends on what kind of data are you using and how are you using it. Or back to what I said earlier, are you making a pre-screened offer or is this sort of a target to a sort of a larger population that then still has to actually apply and go through some other gates. And then just reminder, is this permitted even generally by your privacy statement, your privacy policy? Go back and look at that to make sure that expansion, as well as what I said earlier about the sort of the contracts with producers and other partners who may be the custodian of their data, may not all be your data. So you need to figure out whether or not that this is permissible. Most of the time it is, but sometimes it's not.
Yeah, and Andrea brought up this point. I want to make sure we get to it before we run out of time. So, the last scenario we were talking about was anonymization or de-identifying the data, which is basically taking away presumably, at least finding a way to take away the personally identifiable components of the information. So rather than knowing that Ron Raether bought a sweatshirt from Glacier National Park, just knowing that somebody bought a red sweatshirt from Glacier National Park. So, I want to talk about this de-identification and, is it a cure to some of these issues that we've talked about in terms of privacy, permissions, opt-in, opt-out, sharing the data? Does de-identification fix all those issues for us, Kirk?
It sometimes. I'll give a lawyerly response. In some cases, it does. I mean, the more you append to any record after you've stripped out the name, the more you append to that record, the more likely it is to reassemble the identity. So, it definitely helps. It's not encrypted from a breach notification perspective. You could argue in some cases, depending on how rich the data set is, you may still have some sort of nascent notification requirement. But it's definitely the poor man's way of doing it, and many of my clients have done it, and it is definitely better than sending over personally identifiable information.
So, Andrea, what's your perspective on anonymization, de-identification?
I personally am so happy when there's de-identification. It makes it much, much easier from my perspective in a lot of areas. So, for instance, like from an encryption perspective, if I've got certain requirements that for instance, through GLBA, where there's a tie between a name and an account number, a name and other information that not necessarily would be considered personally identifiable, but because it's in combination with the individual's name or in combination with the individual's driver's license, now it's now becoming a protected piece of information that I've got to look at from a data security perspective. It makes my job easier if it's been masked like that, either masking it or de-identifying it, no longer making it correlate with the person that it was collected from.
So in other words, and I guess in your mind, is there a difference between anonymization and de-identification?
Yes, there is. To me, there is. When they're de-identifying it, I actually, from a technical perspective, expect my database team to really be taking those fields and placing it into a completely different data set in comparison to where it was coming from before, so that that information is no longer even stored or available in its now present format. Whereas when it's masked, I generally feel that the information's still there. I can go backwards. It's a way of, I actually have the ability of going backwards, and I could probably still come up with the information that was previously there. Whereas when I think of a de-identified data set, I think of it as a completely new data set in which I do not have the same security implications.
And I think from a policy writing, contract writing perspective, it's important for us to make sure we're using those terms appropriately and understanding their meaning and defining them so that we get the controls and the protections that we want in place when you de-identify information versus anonymization. I guess I think we're almost out of time. Kirk or Andrea, any last comments or thoughts on that you want to share about today, big data in today's presentation? I'll start with Kirk.
Well, I'll go back to what I said at the case one. I think you have to be careful. You know, this is a space where you need a lot of different roles kind of helping you through this process. I mean, even within my team now, we've segmented duties to a point where there's certain people who are experts in sales privacy laws. There are other people that are more expert in breach laws and understand the nuances. From what I observed from my security peers, that is just a huge expanding space, and I tip my hat to Andrea to be able to manage the complexity of the technology that just seems to be growing every day, and the risks. Right, the risks are they're changing by the minute. So,
Andrea,
probably. I think the only thing I would probably share with this group is you're going to see, probably from a security perspective, in relationship to big data, you're going to see priorities change as far as what technologies your information security department wants to bring forth to the organization. Obviously, there's a huge emphasis. I think the largest one's probably in data leakage protection or data loss prevention. I think secondarily, you're going to see a lot of emphasis on security governance. How do we comply with the regulations that are out there? What tools might assist us with that? I think the third area is probably going to be your privileged administration, privileged password management. So from the employee perspective, are we really making sure that the people that need access have access, and those that no longer need access, that access has been taken away? Because with big data, that information that they now are positioned to potentially exploit if they leave the organization is far bigger and a far larger threat to the reputation of the firm. And then I think the last two areas I would say security is going to become a priority with big data is in your web access, both internally and externally, as far as role-based management. If this individual has this role, kind of going along the lines Kirk was saying, this individual has this role, they should only have access to this data based upon what their job duties are.
Well, I think this has been, at least for me, a very informative and engaging discussion about big data. Hopefully that the audience has had an opportunity to sort of understand some of the parameters in terms of what we're talking about with big data. Sort of my general conclusions are that data governance continues to be, I think, the key in the heart of being able to manage effectively both the privacy and the security issues. Big data, if you look at the themes that we've been talking about, the controls, the policies, the issues, they really apply in the context of small data, In other words, when we're dealing with regulated data or when we're making certain that we have good data practices in place. What we've really been talking about are good data governance practices, and that those still continue to apply even when we're having to deal with big data. Sometimes it requires us to think about these issues in different ways and create different solutions, but ultimately at the core we're still building on good data governance practices. I don't know if we have any questions in terms of the presentation. I don't see any.
Thank you, Ron. And on behalf of LexisNexis, I would like to thank Ron and Kirk and Andrea today for an outstanding program. To our audience, thank you for attending today's complimentary CLE webinar. We ask that you please follow the link to our survey, as your feedback on products and services is an excellent resource for us. Thank you all and have a great day.